How do I get the correct exposure every time I take a photo? Hi and welcome to episode 154 of the Photography Explained podcast, finally. I'm your host Rick, and in each episode I will try to explain one photographic thing to you in plain English in less than 27 minutes-ish without the irrelevant details. What I tell you is based on my lifetime of photographic experience and not Google. Sounding a bit coldy here, aren't I? That's not good, is it? But first, here is the answery bit. To get the exposure right every time you take a photo, you need to choose the right camera settings, compose the photo, take a meter reading, adjust the settings if needed, take the photo, check the results, and then take another photo if you have to, or change your composition or how your subject and the light relate to each other. Yes, it really is that simple. That is how to get the exposure correct every time you take a photo. If only. No, I'm sorry, it's really not that simple, but I will explain and don't worry. We can get this nailed. And I say the correct exposure because that's what we're aiming for, isn't it? No, just the correct exposure within the limitations of what we're trying to capture and what a camera is able to capture, let's not forget. As I said in the last episode, we start taking photos with a problem. A camera cannot capture the same dynamic range that we humans can see with our own eyes. So we start off with some work to do, don't we? Which doesn't seem fair, does it? Right, that was a slightly longer answery bit, and now here is the talky bit. But first, a quick reminder, what is exposure? Well, this is what I said last episode. No point rewriting it, is there? Exposure in photography is the amount of light that reaches the camera sensor when taking a photo. A correctly exed image has captured the range of light in a scene correctly. An underexposed photo is too dark, with information not recorded in the shadows. An overexposed image, easy for you to say, Rick, is too light, with information not recorded in the highlights. That's not boding well for this episode, is it? I can't say overexposed in an episode about exposure. Oh dear. Anyway, so getting the exposure right, it's all about capturing the right amount of light when you're taking a photo. And let's not forget, photography is drawing with light, so this makes sense, doesn't it? And also, light levels are constantly changing, which we always need to remember. Yes, I'm talking about getting the exposure right when you take the photo, not fixing it later on your computer. Now, when we're taking photos, we should firstly get the best composition that we can. And then we should get the best exposure that we can for that composition with the light that's there. Get these two right and you should have a great photo. Well, you could have a great photo, it depends what you're taking a photo of. Break it down like that and it does sound simple, doesn't it? See, this doesn't have to be complicated, does it? Well, I say that, it can be as complicated or as simple as we want to make it. So I'm going to try and break this down and keep things as simple as I can, because that's what I do. So first thing on my list was camera settings. Now the camera settings will determine how your camera records the light. Of course they will. And it makes perfect sense that this will dictate the success or not of a photo. Digital cameras are very good at capturing the light these days, which is a good thing. And they have lots of settings, which is a good thing and a bad thing. Which camera settings you select depends on which mode you're in. See, in manual exposure mode, you set everything. In semi-automatic modes, you change the aperture or shutter and your camera changes things to suit the exposure. And in fully automatic modes, the camera chooses everything. So a little bit more on that. In manual mode, the camera takes the photo with the settings that you have selected, and this is regardless of the correctness or not of the exposure. If your camera's telling you that the photo you're about to take with the settings you've chosen is 5 stops overexposed, the photo it takes will be 5 stops overexposed. And that's it. It's not doing anything other than telling you how the settings relate to what it thinks the exposure should be. Now in semi-automatic modes, the camera will pick the right settings for what you've chosen. And in fully automatic modes, the camera will try to get the best exposure that it can. And the difference between semi-automatic and fully automatic modes is we're principally talking about aperture priority and shutter priority, or is it shutter speed priority, where you change the aperture and the camera changes the shutter speed accordingly, and if you change the shutter speed, it changes the aperture. So the two are working together, one you're setting and the camera's matching the other one to the exposure. Okay, so that's the 3 different modes, which I have covered before, but I just wanted to touch on that here. So what are the main settings that affect exposure? Well, aperture, of course. The aperture is the opening in the camera lens that lets the light through to the camera sensor when you take a photo. Larger aperture, smaller number, more light gets in. Smaller aperture, larger number, less light gets in. I know, it's counterintuitive, isn't it? f4, small aperture, f22, large aperture. Sorry, I got that the wrong way around, didn't I? f4, large aperture, f22, small aperture. How I said actually was the logical way, wasn't it? Yes, it can get confusing. Shutter speed. Well, the shutter speed is simply the amount of time the shutter is open exposing the camera sensor to light. Or film, that is. Let's not forget good old film, which I will touch on at the end of this episode. And this one makes more sense. Fast shutter speed, shorter time, less light gets through. Slower shutter speed, longer time, more light gets through. Yeah, makes sense, doesn't it? Aperture, counterintuitive. Well, the principle's right, the numbers are illogical. Shutter speed just makes sense. And then there's ISO. ISO is the sensitivity of the camera sensor to light, or more accurately, how the sensor deals with the light that reaches it. So it depends on what it's set at. Now, the sensitivity of the sensor does not actually change when you change the ISO, but the brightness of the image does. The relationship of aperture, shutter speed and ISO is called the exposure triangle, and this is another one for another episode. On that point of ISO, I'm going to cover ISO in an episode all of its own. Yeah, I'm sort of regretting saying that now, but I'm sure I'll find some good stuff in there. It's not the most interesting subject, but there is a very important point about the sensitivity of the camera sensor to light and a common perception, but I'll cover that then. I've mentioned it now, just like a bit of a tease, isn't it? Okay, to summarise this bit, we adjust the amount of light that gets through to the camera sensor using the aperture and the shutter. How the camera sensor processes the light depends on the ISO setting. These three exposure settings determine if a photo is correctly exposed or not. I'll say this more than once. Incorrect exposures, they're not acceptable. We need to get a proper exposure every time that we take a photo. Unless you want to overexpose or underexpose deliberately for creative or whatever purposes. In that case, it's fine, but ordinarily, you need to get the best exposure that you can. And like I say, I'm going to cover these different bits, aperture, shutter and ISO, each on their own in future episodes. And here I want to stick with the how bit of getting the exposure correct, starting with the camera metering modes. Metering modes, well, we can use the camera's light meter to evaluate the light in a photo, and cameras have different metering modes. These change how the camera measures the light in a scene, and I'm going to cover these in a future episode as well. I want to stick to the point, just give you the bits that are relevant here. Now, evaluative metering is the default metering mode. Well, it is in the Canon ecosystem anyway, and it's a great place to start, and it's what I use. It's a great all-round metering mode, and it's the default mode for a reason. The other modes on my Canon 6D are spot metering, partial metering, and center-weighted average metering. Yeah, I've dabbled with these in the past, but evaluative metering is just fine, so that's what I stick with, and that's what my script says, thankfully. So for now, let's stick with the default metering mode, which will be evaluative mode or similar. And that is the main camera settings relating to exposure. Many of these things you set in camera, leaving the aperture and the shutter speed as the variables when you take a photo. Talking of photos, back to my list which I read out as my answery bit. Compose the photo. Well, important this, and yeah, I know I'm talking about exposure, but this is relevant, isn't it? I want to say that we should all take time to get the best composition that we can, and then get the best exposure for that composition. Now, we might have to change the composition if the light's challenging, but we should start off by trying to get the photo that we want to first. If it doesn't work, we can always go to plan B, and as we've got digital cameras these days, taking another photo doesn't cost us anything other than a bit more time, does it? Next thing, take a meter reading. To take a meter reading for your composition, press the shutter release button gently. They say halfway, but how you can judge what halfway is on a button that you can't really see moving is beyond me. Press it gently, that's good enough for me. And your camera should focus at the same time, and some stuff will appear in your viewfinder. Now I'm saying stuff because it depends on your camera and what mode you've got it in. So flashing stuff, this is what I want to bring you to your attention. Normally, anything that flashes in the viewfinder needs attention. If you press the shutter release button halfway and something's flashing, something normally needs sorting. And it's normally exposure related. Or it could be a warning that you're using a slow shutter speed, which means you need to be mindful of camera shake. Now, of course, different cameras have different flashing things, and I can't possibly cover all of them, but I can say with confidence that if something's flashing, you probably need to do something. Very important detailed technical principle there. Adjust the settings if needed. Well, if something's flashing, make an adjustment until it stops flashing. That's flashing stuff sorted, and I didn't want to get too technical there. If something's flashing, make an adjustment until it stops flashing. That's genius advice, isn't it? Right, so what's an overexposed photo? If the camera's Sorry, I'm in danger of losing it here. I was doing ever so well on the talking. Well, I thought I was anyway. If the camera is showing that the image will be overexposed, the photo will be too bright. You need to reduce the amount of light getting through to the camera sensor. This can be done by choosing, I have to be careful writing these because I quite often get them the wrong way round, a faster shutter speed, a smaller aperture, or changing to a lower ISO number. So a faster shutter speed, less time, less light. A smaller aperture, less light, and changing to a lower ISO number, you're reducing the brightness of the photo. More on that shortly. Overexposed photo equals too much light. Now, what about an underexposed photo then? Well, if the camera is showing that the image will be underexposed, the photo will be too dark. You need to increase the amount of light getting through to the camera sensor. This can be done by selecting a slower shutter speed, shutter open for more time, exposing the sensor to more light, a larger aperture, bigger opening, more light, or changing to a higher ISO number. And another thing you can do is you can add a flash or other additional lighting. Not something that I talk about often because it's not my strong suit, not something I'm very good at, and not something I like doing. Underexposed equals not enough light. If something flashes telling you there's a risk of camera shake, choose a faster shutter speed. Simple, eh? Next stage, take the photo. Well, this is the good bit, isn't it? Taking the photo. Enjoy this bit. And next, check the results. And if they're fine, it was a good bit. If it's rubbish, it could have gone better, couldn't it? So have a look at the photo, either on the camera's LCD screen or through the electronic viewfinder. Not that I have one on my Canon 6D. Or on your phone if you got it connected. Now, obviously, if you're using a phone, just, look at your phone. So, does the image look okay? Is it too bright? Is it too dark? Now, on my Canon 6D, I can set the camera so if the highlights are overexposed, or blown out as we like to call them, the affected area blinks in black. Now, this is a really handy thing and it gives you a very quick and visual notice that something is wrong. See, it's another flashy thing. Check the histogram. Well, the histogram is I must stop saying well at the beginning of sentences because I've not written that. Let's try that again, Rick. The histogram is a visual representation of the brightness of an image and the distribution of light in the exposure. It is a scale rather strangely from 1 to 255, where 1 is the blackest black and 255 is the whitest white. That's my loose interpretation of it, but it works for me. Now, I did read somewhere recently that it has 256 vertical bars, but that might be an extra one at one end that I hadn't accounted for, but sorry, shut up, Rick, that's not important. What's important is the left-hand end is 100% black and the right-hand end is 100% white. Now, again, I'm going to cover histograms in a separate episode all of their own. Brace yourselves for that one. And this is really hard to describe, but I'm going to give it a go here. For correct exposure, you don't want the column to the left to be above the baseline, nor the column to the right, and I'm talking the edges here. If the histogram is halfway up the vertical scale on the left-hand end, your photo is underexposed, and that's a lot underexposed. And the same applies at the right-hand end, but overexposed. With a darker image, there is more stuff to the left. With a brighter image, there is more stuff to the right. And with a correctly exposed image, or a normal brightness image, the light is more centrally and evenly distributed. What you want is for the graph to start to rise somewhere to the right of the left-hand end and to drop down to the baseline before the right-hand end of the scale. Like I say, not easy to describe. Check out the blog post for the episode where I've added a picture from the Canon 6D manual. Now that's a picture of a dark image, a correctly exposed image and a light image. It very simply explains it, and you can find this at photographyexplainedpodcast.com. And it's / how do I get the correct exposure every time I take a photo. So that's what it looks like on a Canon camera, but but you will find the histogram somewhere on most modern cameras. Well, you should know this as you've read the camera manual, right? I hope you have. Insert photo here, it says on the script. So yeah, check out the blog post. And the picture will explain in seconds what I've probably failed to explain in a lot of words. So 3 things that tell you if you have a correct exposure or not. The photo's too bright or too dark. Blinky things. And the histogram is too high on the left-hand end or the right-hand end. If you got the correct exposure, job done and move on. But if you have not got the correct exposure, make an adjustment and take it again. So if the photo is too dark, is underexposed, you need more light. So you pick a slower shutter speed, leaving the camera sensor exposed to light for longer, or choose a larger aperture with a smaller aperture value. Or alternatively, choose a higher ISO, increasing the brightness of the image capture. The photo's too light and overexposed. Less light is required. Pick a faster shutter speed, leaving the camera sensor exposed to light for less time, or choose a smaller aperture, larger aperture value. Or alternatively, choose a lower ISO value, which reduces the brightness of the image capture. Take another photo and have another look. If the image looks okay, then great. If not, repeat as above. But what if you're using a fully automatic mode? Well, with my Canon 6D, that's it. In the fully automatic modes, the camera does all the work for you. Apart from in program mode, that is, where you can use exposure compensation. And this is why, if you're looking to get into photography seriously, you will quickly move away from the fully automatic modes because you don't have this individual control. Now, you might have on other cameras which are more recent and from other brands, but on my Canon 6D, these automatic modes are automatic modes, apart from, like I say, the program mode. I've mentioned exposure compensation. What is it? Well, it's a quick way of increasing or reducing the brightness of a photo. On my Canon 6D, you can use it in P for program, and that's not P for professional, by the way, and also in AV, aperture value, aperture priority, and TV, time value, shutter speed priority. I've written in my script here ad-lib, but I can't remember what it was I was meant to be ad-libbing about. I'll come on to what I do later. So you can change the brightness by turning the wheel on the back of the camera. Well, you can on my Canon 6D anyway. And there will be another full episode on exposure compensation, which that's the one that's causing me quite a lot of concern because I don't think there's enough in exposure compensation for a whole episode. But I'm sure it'll be great when it comes out, and I'm sure I'll find some other stuff to make it work. Another couple of things. AE lock. On my Canon 6D, I can use AE lock to lock the exposure, and then I can move the camera, focus and take a shot with the exposure locked. What this means is that I've got a bit more control using AE lock by I can take an exposure from a different part of the photo and make that the priority in the photo. And this works really well. Again, it's another one that's really hard to describe in words, but check out your camera, see what you've got that's similar. So you can take an exposure in one place and then you turn your camera to look in a different place and you keep the same exposure. Like I say, give it a try. It works really well. Can't remember when I last used it, to be honest with you. Okay, another consideration, RAW or JPEG. Well, what's this got to do with exposure, Rick? I'll tell you here. RAW files are RAW files. There is no processing done to them. JPEG files have processing done to them in camera. Now, I use RAW for all my photos as I want to record the maximum amount of data when I take a photo and make the decisions about the processing myself. JPEG files are already processed and you need to work out which is best for you when it comes to the photos that you take and the success or not of the exposure. I feel that I get more data and more latitude shooting in RAW, which helps me to get the best exposures that I can. Now, some people will disagree with this, and that's fine. That's what I do. I just want to make you aware that there is a consideration there. Shooting in JPEG, processing is done by the camera. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing. It just depends on you. So, there we have it. That is it in a nutshell. Putting everything else to one side and concentrating on the fundamentals. That is how you get the correct exposure. Or is it? Nope. There's one little bit more, and it's not that little. That was just the beginning. That's the technical side. That's the how you get the camera to record the thing you want to record. It's the numbers and the settings. Oh, I've written in my script here because I was ad-libbing then. How your camera captures and records the light. Well done, Rick. But we as photographers have a hand in this as well. Of course we do. You can get better exposures by thinking about the composition, arranging the elements in the composition and using the light effectively to get the right exposure. A little bit of thought can get you from massive problems with exposure to a correctly exposed photo. Now, let me give you a couple of examples, because examples are always good, aren't they? If you're photographing someone on a sunny day and you have the sun right behind your subject, you're probably going to struggle to get the correct exposure. Think about your composition and how your subject and the light relate to each other. Don't try to capture more than your camera is able to capture. This just does not work. So change your viewpoint or move the subject so the range of lights and darks is less. And in this case, you could add a flash to balance out the light and that would work nicely. But if you're photographing somebody with the sun behind them, their face will be in shadow because the sun is so bright. It's just a fact. But if you rotate through 180 degrees, the sun's lighting up the face and you get a completely different and pleasing effect and the light is more balanced. Now, an example from the work that I do, which is photographing buildings. More on that at rickmcavoyphotography.com. Oh, shameless plug. I quite often have to photograph steel columns with a bright sky behind them. It's quite a thing when a building's being constructed, just the framework. It's a really dramatic thing that only happens during that process of the construction. You never see it again once the building's been enclosed, so it's one of my favourite things to photograph. Now, I know that I can't get a correct exposure in a single image capture as the steel's dark and the sky behind and around is bright, so I have to do something different. Now, I know this because this is what I do all the time, but this is what I do. I use auto bracketing. I take 3 photos, one with the correct exposure, 1 photo 2 stops underexposed, and 1 photo 2 stops overexposed. And I merge these 3 photos together in Lightroom. This is massive for me and it works pretty much every time. And again, I'm going to do a full episode on this, it's such a fundamental technique that I use when I'm taking photos of buildings. You can use it in landscapes and other things, called auto bracketing, and it's a feature built into my Canon 6D. Okay, a word on practice. Whatever you do, however you take your photos, there is no substitute for practice. And I'm talking here about getting the best exposure that you can in camera every time. This does not happen immediately, and the results will vary with lighting conditions, subject matter, and how all this stuff hangs together. But practice, practice, practice until you know how to get the best exposure you can for every photo in every situation. And if you do that, your photography life will be so much easier and your photos will be so much better and you'll be so grateful you've listened to me. Right, that was the talky bit over. So what if I use a phone and not a camera? I use an iPhone. Using the default camera app, get the composition that you want, touch the screen and AE/AF lock appears on the screen. Move it where you want it to be and take the photo. And you can also from there adjust the brightness by touching the sun icon to the right and sliding up for brighter and down for less bright. Simple, eh? And this can turn a bad photo into a really good and of course well exposed photo. And as for phones other than iPhones, sorry I've got no idea, but I'm sure that you can do the same with them. The principles are exactly the same and I'm sure that every phone has got some kind of feature, whatever it's called, built into it. Okay, so what if I use a film camera? Well, yeah, you have to pretty much get it right first time. There's no checking what you have with film cameras, changing a setting and taking another photo. You might want to take more than one photo with different settings if there is a concern, but you won't know until you get the processed film back if you got it right or not. Now, as horrendous as that sounds, practice and experience help massively to get the right exposure when shooting with film. The thought of that, it's quite bad, isn't it? Not being able to check a photo when you've taken it. That's like going back to the dark ages, isn't it? But not that long ago, that was all we had. Digital hasn't been around for that long. When I was starting out in photography, and for many, many years of me learning and practicing photography, we didn't have digital. All we had was film. I had a roll of film with 24 or 36 exposures, and that was it. And every photo cost me money. We need to remember that when we're taking photos. It's not a case of just taking a load of photos with different settings and choosing the best one when you get back to your computer. It's about applying the principles of taking photos with film and applying those principles to the camera settings and trying to get the exposure right with the first photo. That's what this is about. Okay, what do I do? Same as last episode, but no harm going over this again, and I think I've expanded on it slightly. So this is what I do. I put my DSLR camera on a tripod, so I have automatically removed any issues with the shutter speed settings and do not need to worry about camera shake. I'm photographing buildings in the main, remember, they're not moving. Wait, don't not. I set the lowest ISO that I can, which is normally 100. I rarely change the ISO setting. I shoot in RAW. I use AV mode, also known as aperture priority mode. I choose the aperture and the camera chooses the shutter speed. I can't actually remember when I last used shutter priority mode thinking about it. And the aperture setting I use is normally f8, and if it's not f8, it's f16, and that's 95% of my photos. As I said, I use auto bracketing, and I focus, meter, and press the shutter button. The camera takes 3 photos using auto bracketing. The camera chooses the shutter speeds for the 3 exposures because I've chosen the aperture. And I merge each set of 3 photos together in Lightroom to give me one shiny new photo with a broader dynamic range, which I edit. That's what I do. Some thoughts from the last episode. Well, the last episode was all about what exposure is. This episode was the how to get the right exposure. But it's worth saying again that this is something that we all need to learn and understand. It's so fundamental to photography. It is, after all, about capturing the correct amount of light, and that's the right range of brightness to correctly photograph a scene. Okay, I finally made it here. So, what happened? What happened 2 weeks ago? Well, I'm so delighted, and I'm not going to lie to you, which I haven't used in this episode, which is good. I'm so relieved to finally get this episode out. I mean, what happened basically was my computer had a moment and I had to delete a load of stuff, change some settings and give my PC a boost, quite literally, with something called Ready Boost, which I'd never heard of before. It cost me just over a tenner for an SD card, which I chucked into the SD card reader, and that's helped with the performance. Why did I have to do this? Well, I recorded the last episode and there was lots of bad digital stuff, and when I say bad, so bad that I couldn't publish the episode. And I couldn't edit it out. It was so bad. So I spent ages trying to fix the software. I tried re-records, different software. Nothing worked. And it turned out that my computer was, and I don't know why, it wasn't able to record all the audio. It wasn't working properly. Anyway, fixed, all sorted and happy. And I have a computer which is running faster than ever. All good stuff in the end. Next episode, which I am confident I can record and edit and get out. And it was going to be how do I get the correct exposure with my camera phone, but I changed my mind. I covered that quickly in this episode. Now, in the next episode, I'm going to talk all about aperture, just that and no more. And I'm going to learn some stuff here because I don't think I could talk for 20 minutes off the top of my head about aperture. So looking forward to diving into that one a little bit more deeply, but not too deeply, just enough to help us. And no, I haven't written that episode yet. This is me in anticipation. Okay, if you have a question you would like me to answer, just head over to photographyexplainedpodcast.com/doc where you can find out what I do. Or you can just say hello. That's fine. Either way, it'd be lovely to hear from you. Okay, that's all. Well, this episode was brought to you by, for a change, a cheese and pickle sandwich and a bag of salt and vinegar crisps, all washed down with a nice cold Diet Pepsi. All consumed before I settle down in my homemade, acoustically cushioned recording emporium. Now, today's highly technical acoustic treatment is 1 pillow and 3 fleecy hoodies, and that's it. Interested to see how echoey this recording is, but I think we're all good there, so finally I got to the end. What a relief. I've been Rick McAvoy. Thanks again very much for listening to my small but perfectly formed podcast, it says here, and for giving me 27-ish minutes of your valuable time. Well, I think this one's going to be 28, 29 minutes long after I've edited out all the rubbish, but we're all good. Thanks for bearing with me. Delighted to be back. Take care, stay safe. Cheers from me, Rick.